That was the first intervention on collectivist ecology. The second will address from prologiology. We're going to address now the concept of red natural history. Red natural history, which names a tradition of natural history that is not built on colonial or capitalist relations, but on comradely and reciprocal relations to land, life, and labor. And this intervention will be performed by Andrew Curley, a citizen of the Dine nation, assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development and Environment at the University of Arizona, Tucson. And his work addresses specifically how indigenous communities understand coal, energy, land, water infrastructure, and development in an era of energy transition and climate catastrophe. And Andrew is a collaborator on the concept of red natural history with Steve Lyons, a member of the US-based collective Not an Alternative. Not an Alternative works at the intersection of art, activism, and critical theory. It's an exceptional group that has developed critical tools of movement building in the Occupy movement in the past years through their agitational propaganda mobile museum to expose fossil industry sponsorship of Natural History Museum. We've been wanting to bring you for a long time here. It's the first time that we're welcoming both Andrew and Steve to the Netherlands. So we're very grateful that today we can finally give you the floor. Please welcome with me Andrew Curley and Steve Lyons.
So intimidating speaking with so many great Ediacaran comrades here. So I represent Not an Alternative, a collective of artists, activists, and theorists who have spent the past decade developing a project called the Natural History Museum. So the Natural History Museum, none of us part of the Natural History Museum project are scientists or natural historians in any stripe. We are artists, activists, theorists who have backgrounds in doing social movement work. So the Natural History Museum started as an experiment. It started as an experiment of entering the sector for science and natural history museums in the United States as a kind of fraud. Mobilizing the visual language, the sort of authoritative visual language of mainstream natural history museums in order to enter and then force political decisions with other natural history museums as a peer. So not as an activist group from the outside, but as a peer institution. So the first thing that we did was we got officially accredited by the American Alliance of Museums, which is the association that grants museum status to museums. So that's all to say that as a critical intervention into the institutional infrastructure for science and natural history in the United States, our aim is not only to critique mainstream natural history museums, although we do that as well, but also to model a challenging alternative. So I'm here with Andrew Curley, who's been working with us for the past several years as one of 8 Red Natural History Fellows, which is a cohort, or you could call it a think tank, of scholar activists who are coming together to define a tradition and practice of natural history that is not built on colonial or capitalist relations, but on a comradely and reciprocal relation to life, land, and labor. So we're calling this alternate tradition Red Natural History. So most broadly, the project aims to develop tools and perspectives for to bring back yesterday's conversation for washing brains, as Mao put it, right? So that we can see, relate to, and organize around the options that are not options under capitalism. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes laying out some of the theoretical coordinates for this project. They'll be abstract, and then Andrew will have the great privilege of grounding the plane, of showing us how some of these ideas and propositions might help us reconsider the ongoing resource wars on the Colorado River, which is incredibly important in the United States Southwest. Natural history, so just to begin, natural history is a capacious umbrella. So understood at its very broadest, it names the empirical and humanistic study of the social, political, and natural forces that have shaped the material world. So both the forces that have plundered, profited from, and poisoned the land, water, and air, unevenly driving the planet's vital ecosystems to the brink, as well as the forces that have at every turn stood in the way. So even in its purest form, natural history is an applied pursuit. As a project of studying the world, it has always played a role in transforming the world. So by now, everyone in this room, as we've just heard from Vincent, has some understanding of how the natural sciences have grown in lockstep with imperialist expansion, as well as how they remain to be crucial resources for extraction, militarism, and capital accumulation. So we know that from its origins, geology provided key resources to locate and extract natural resources from the earth, geography to map both physical terrain and the political divisions in advance of military operations, ecology to classify relations between organisms in unfamiliar landscapes in order to better exploit them for profit, hydrology to re-engineer waterways for unsustainable settlements and monocrop irrigation, ethnography to justify the extermination of supposedly backwards societies. So some critics of this imperialist history of natural history have used it as a reason to discredit the entire enterprise of modern science and to render its tools untouchable. But while the basis for such a critique is bulletproof, there really is no doubt, right, that such disciplinary forms developed in tandem with Euro-American empire, the conclusion is not. So as we saw very clearly at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and are about to see again in the United States, the blanket critique of science can be perfectly reconcilable with the so-called conspiracist propaganda that Sven discussed yesterday. And that propaganda machine is today far better organized than any propaganda infrastructure coming from the left. But this is more than a strategic question, right? The thing is, natural history is not inherently anything. It is a site of struggle, a means to many ends. And the temptation to throw the baby out with the imperialist bathwater in favor of more innocent tools is to conflate the means with the ends. So the challenge, we argue, is not to sort between good and bad tools, but to struggle over, adapt, and mobilize the resources and institutions at our disposal as means to an emancipatory end. So this is the hypothesis that grounds what we're calling Red Natural History, a project we might define not as a form of climate propaganda in and of itself, but as kind of the epistemological substrate for emancipatory propaganda. So I'm going to briefly lay out 6 propositions, very briefly, that are central to this unfolding project, and then Andrew's going to show us how it can orient our perspective in this unfolding debate over water scarcity in the US Southwest. So proposition 1, natural history is not the neutral study of nature, ecosystems, or pre-modern cultural traditions, no matter what your local natural history museum says. But it's also not an intrinsically colonial enterprise. Rather, we argue it is a history of struggle between 2 incommensurate projects of world-making. One governed by a logic of extraction and enclosure, and another that relates to the world as a world in common that cannot be enclosed. The first is fundamentally organized around the production and reproduction of capital, the other around the reproduction of collective life. So when we take the perspective of Red Natural History, and this is our part of the same proposition, we open a path for new alliances, not on the grounds of our common or even intersecting identities, but on the grounds of our shared obligation to this project of reproducing collective life. 2, this counter-tradition of natural history, which participates in propagating a world that cannot fit in the capitalist world, does not need to be invented from whole cloth. Rather, it exists in the world-making practices of the oppressed, of societies whose traditions, practices of research, modes of life, modes of development push against extraction and enclosure and model a different relationship to the world we share in common. So we saw this yesterday with Jonas's beautiful example of Thomas Sankara's One Village, One Grove, and Vincent spoke about Bogdanov, for example. Both are great examples of researchers, practitioners who offer tools and modes of scientific inquiry that are developed not based on or coming out of imperialist projects that we briefly explained above, but based on principles developed by communists, anarchists, non-Western societies, anti-colonial rebels, indigenous nations, and so on. So there's another tradition. It already exists. But the question is, how do we organize around it? So proposition 3 is, while the outlines of this alternate tradition of natural history exist, today it's largely understood as a kind of array of fragments or a grab bag of examples, not one organized front in the struggle, right? So our argument is that if it is to make a dent in this broad ideological struggle that liberals and right-wing nuts are fighting largely among themselves, but both on the side of capitalism, this other tradition of natural history would do well to take on a common name. And we are proposing that red natural history is an adequate name for the natural history of our side. 4, by demarcating our side in the split in natural history, red natural history clears space for internal realignments, innovations, power building, synthesis, as well as disagreements, fights, and other splits that will be necessary for us to have without allowing those divisions to tear us into a proliferating array of little differences that make no difference at all. So it frames our fight as a fight among comrades over the correct means to the end of collective well-being, premised on a common sense that our health depends on the health of the animals, plants, and non-human systems that we inhabit. So to paraphrase Nick Estes here, red natural history is not oriented by the question of what we, as a universal we, want from the land and water, but what the land and water want from us. This next point I think is pretty important. The science of climate change, in all of its ideological forms, points to one conclusion. As a centuries-long living experiment in making natural history, capitalist developmentalism was the stuff of utopian fantasy, completely incompatible with the wants of the water and the land. So in this context, the only practical solutions are revolutionary solutions. And this is a materialist claim, not exclusively a moral one. Last principle before I hand it over to Andrew. Red natural history is not a settled project. It's an invitation to define the perspectives, tools, and resources from which we can see and engage with the world from a non-capitalist and anti-colonial view. So it is not the silver bullet solution, but it's an orientation with which to work out solutions. It renders the tools of science and natural history broadly construed, including those honed and fashioned in extra-institutional spaces by indigenous communities, for example, toward that horizon. So claiming that we already have all of the answers closes a central political gap within which red natural history does its work, which is the struggle amongst ourselves to determine the best path forward, to make advances, to try and fail, and to think transition. So none of this would actually matter if there weren't people working around the world, scientists, communities, organizations, and activists who are developing concrete practices of red natural history within the resource wars of our contemporary moment. But to return to point 2, there are generations of dissident environmental work, practices of living research that we would do well to build upon, and which people today are drawing on in their collective responses to the disasters brought on by the other side. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrew now, who's going to give us a much more grounded and concrete sense of how red natural history can orient our perspective on the issues that people are facing in the United States, focusing arguably the most colonized river in North America, the Colorado River, and the struggles playing out over its future.
Great. Thank you, Steve. This is how we introduce ourselves or talk to each other. And it's sometimes interpreted as a hello, but actually it means it is good. It's good to be here. And so, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we're here, my wife and I, and that we came all the way from Arizona to share some of our issues and struggles with a settler colonial society. What I'm fundamentally talking about here, linking it to this larger idea of red natural history, is how the natural world around us is commodified through an imperialistic science, right? And then through a science that is racist and colonial in its inheritance, in its lineage. And so we see that play out in 2024 based on logics that go back a century or more into 1922 and earlier. And these replicate social inequalities and colonial inequalities between indigenous peoples and settler societies. And at root, what we're saying is that indigenous people, what red natural history seeks to recover is indigenous science, right? Not to render us as primitive peoples with some sort of utopianistic solution, but actually a long-standing knowledge of the planet and what we call resources, even though that itself is an ontological rendering of the world around us that is capitalistic in origin, about exploitation in some ways, but to rethink these ideas as a basis for life. And so it's to get to the point when we're talking about water, which was interrupting our feed for a second, water as a commodity, right? That's the Marxist, that's how Marx begins his text, is to think about how the world becomes a commodity fetish, and water as a basis for life. So how is it that our understanding of water in the Southwest as a basis of life becomes a commodity, becomes something that is used for capitalist ends? And that is the making of the Colorado River and the space around it. And I created this slide out of an airplane, which is probably like the worst, greenhouse gas emitting type of machine, and which brought me here actually, but like over this landscape that is unnatural, right? These utopianistic capitalist fantasies, these large monoculture agricultural farms built in the desert with the diversion and damming of water. And so the way that we can understand this is through how utopianistic capitalists or utopian capitalists came in from a class perspective. And I'll just read some of my notes. The construction of colonial capitalism, this is a version of capitalism, right, that exists in North America and is similar to how we think about imperialism. One of the first ingredients is racism. In order to dismiss existing stewards of the land, the people who have had centuries of applied science and understanding the waters that comprise the river, settler colonialists had to render indigenous peoples lesser humans. They do this through racist propaganda, creating racist worlds where people understood each other by clan and nation prior. So that's how we understood each other. A similar word that we've been talking about here, camaraderie, we talk about like what Melanie Yazzie calls radical relationality, or as Dine people always say, as a way that we relate with each other. So indigenous peoples did not participate and were not allowed at the table when these resources were thought about and divided. And famously, the main critics of overallocation, of the overexploitation of the Colorado River, say it's because we weren't listening to science is why we overuse the river. We, this large collective we, which doesn't include indigenous people, are running short of water. And what we don't acknowledge is the fact that indigenous people had a working understanding of the river and its tributaries, but were not brought at the table. And so some of the work that I've been doing with the Red Natural History Project is to think about this colonial infrastructure as a form of imperialistic and capital beachheads, as an infrastructure that is built for the benefit of capital accumulation and colonial expansion. And some of the most famous infrastructures that we talk about are things like the Hoover Dam and the Central Arizona Project. And these render space in a very a particular way. You have this high modernist idealism, and it moves water towards the expansion of mega cities like Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and Las Vegas, at the expense of indigenous water use and water rights. And to this day, the Navajo Nation, or the Dine, the people from which my partner and I come, we don't have quote unquote rights of access to divert and deplete water. We're still negotiating that with the state of Arizona. And Arizona, California, Nevada, all of these other states, they have right to deplete, divert these waters. And so the intervention that I'm making alongside with the Red Natural History on this project is to say that when we talk about climate crises, when we talk about, oh wait, this is one more slide I added for European audience. And that's to say, a lot of times we come over here and we're seen as this, right, on the left. And that is because of a longstanding propaganda, racist propaganda, to dismiss indigenous people and to make us seem simplistic and undereducated and not having a basis of knowledge. And so this is actually a white guy who's dressed like an Indian. He looks like he spilled ketchup and mustard all over him. And he's, and this is a 1955 portrayal. It's on the Navajo Nation. You can see the buttes of Monument Valley in the background. And, he's just kind of hodgepodge of indigenous peoples right there, right? There's not any kind of particular culture he's representing. It's just a stereotyping. And this is an actual image of how we were in 1955, participating in local elections. These are chapter house elections that are happening. So we're thinking about these political questions. We're capable of understanding these important issues that collectively as humans we all face. And our participation in some of these conversations is ignored and reduced because of these racist stereotypings. Okay, so getting back to the intervention that I'm trying to make along with others in this Red Natural History project, and in my project in particular, is to say our climate narrative, our climate anxiety around this kind of dystopic environmental world that we will inhabit is built on colonial foundations. And the climate science that is concerned about drought is actually building its analyses on physical, material, colonial structures like the Hoover Dam, like the Central Arizona Project that divert water, that dam water, that take it away from indigenous water practices and move it towards expanding agricultural needs and profit. And so, goes into places like the Imperial Valley in California that names itself after what it's doing, right? Imperialism. And so what we have here is a formula for how, coming out of a scientific paper on drought and potential climate crisis on the Colorado River, and within its assumptions as a scientific approach is this idea of the plus or minus reservoir regulation. And these reservoirs, I'm arguing, are colonial infrastructures that are assumed into the natural flow of the river. So now we naturalize the world around us without taking into account historical injustices. And so it's to say the climate challenge is not some sort of future. Temporally, the intervention is also, it's not some sort of future problem. It's existing problems. It's problems that go back 100 years and more that start with colonialism. So unless you deal with colonial inequalities and continue in the social reproduction of colonialism through our climate narratives, then we're not going to come to a place where we can have justice within climate activism. And that is something that's required for all of our talk about climate change. So that's the intervention that I'm making with the Colorado River. I'm done. Okay, we're done.
All right.